interview was I was working at Swazi Radio as the office boy for 250 Rand a month, which even in those days was very little money. And I was approached.
It sounds like little money even today.
It's very little money today. It was little money then. And you know what? Every end of the month when I got paid, I would think to myself, and they pay me, I would do this stuff for nothing.
I see.
I was enjoying it so much. I honestly would have worked for free. So I was approached by a family friends of my mother, who had a factory, a tie factory of all things, and they were looking for someone to take over from the CEO who was getting on in years. They offered me double what I was earning.
They offered you 500 a month.
They offered me 500 a month, which is, but you got to put it in perspective. It was double.
Yes.
And that I would get shares in the business and I would eventually take over from the owner.
And you become the Thai guy.
I would become the Thai guy. And I went to my uncle, who was my mentor. Whenever I had something to discuss, when I needed guidance, I went to my uncle, not my father. My father had this thing about, he would tell me a dozen reasons why something I was attempting to do wouldn't work. So I stopped approaching him. I stopped going to him for advice.
Why is that important? We'll come back to your uncle. Why is that important that if you approach someone multiple times who's an influential figure in your life and they keep on telling you a dozen reasons why something will not work?
Well, all I did is I stopped approaching him.
Yes. Why is it important to do that?
To what?
To stop approaching somebody who does that.
Because he was not mentoring me. He was giving me reasons why something wouldn't work. I wanted someone who would not necessarily give me reasons why it wouldn't work, but who would guide me. He would say, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? What about this? What about that? Anyway, I went to see my uncle. I told him the story that I'd been approached, and he said to me, asked me one question. He said, do you enjoy what you're doing? I said, I love what I'm doing. He said, then continue doing it. He said, if it's a labor of love, the money will come. If you pursue the money will elude you because it's not a labor of love. If you love what you're doing and it's a labor of love, you'll go the extra mile. And by going the extra mile, the money will come. And I went back to Swazi Radio and I didn't hold a gun to their head. I said, listen, I was approached. I've turned the job down. I'm just mentioning it to you. They immediately doubled my money and
to 500.
To 500.
Yeah.
Even 500 wasn't a lot of money, but it was double what I was getting.
Sure.
And I stuck to it because I had a mentor who put it in perspective for me. And that's the role of a mentor, to give you perspective, you know?
So after this episode, if you're watching here, we're going to be having something called the Next Gen Mentorship here on the It's More Than Just Money Movement channel. And Stan Katz will be spearheading the setting up of the Next Gen Mentorship because he's far more experienced. He's done the business work across the world, across Africa. And I want to come back to you, Stan, and also pose this question, right? What do you think mentees, we talking about anyone, young and old, will be watching this platform called Next Gen Mentorship? What do you envision them gaining out of that?
Well, what I envisage them doing, and I always use this expression, if you have one or two questions, I have one or two answers. And the way I envisage it working, I mean, we haven't actually discussed in great detail how it's going to work, but if people would approach me, and I think we're going to do it weekly, approach me with a question, I could then give them the mentor's answer in the following week, or however we decide we're going to get the questions that I can give answers to.
Do you think South African youth need mentors? And,
Yes.
And if so,
I think they
what do you think the gap is?
I think they want mentors. I was absolutely amazed and honored when I saw how many people responded to our last interview, part one of this interview.
Yes.
Young people, yeah, well, I don't know how old they were, young and old.
Yeah.
But
young at heart.
young at heart. You got to be young at heart, man. You got to be young at heart. What they got out of that interview, and I thought, wow, I was amazed. I was honored that they thought I could teach them something. And when people approach you and you feel you can teach them something, you have to do it. You can't not do it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm actually looking forward to doing next-gen mentorship.
So mentorship versus management, right? When you look at...
Well, you can be a manager and a mentor. And in fact, a manager should be a mentor.
Yeah. So how does mentoring young leaders differ from managing them? So say, for instance, I'm a manager in a company, right? How is managing them versus mentoring them actually differ?
It doesn't differ, really. Mm-hmm. Look, a leader is a facilitator. It's not an order giver. And if you're a manager or a leader, well, if you are a manager, you should be a leader anyway. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you another example. In fact, I was having a coffee with someone who used to work for me many years ago. He was head of our promotions department at 947, which was one of the stations.
Jacaranda?
No. Highveld.
Highveld Studio, okay.
947. It was called Highveld Stereo in those days. Mm. And he reminded me of that I was his boss, and we ran an ad, and it had a spelling mistake. And he didn't know what to do with himself. He was so beside himself. He was so distraught. He came to me and he said, look what I've done. What am I going to do? I said, did anybody die? He said, no, nobody died. I said, well, don't do it again. And people know when they've done something wrong. You don't have to tear them apart. They know when they've done something wrong. It's giving them the courage to try again.